Okay, yeah, well, I'll go ahead and start. Hello, welcome. My name is Rai. I'm an SFAI BFA alumni and current grad student at UC Davis for Native American Studies. I'm here as a collaborator with the San Francisco Artist Alumni, SFAA, and I'll be introducing the artists featured here today. SFAA Spotlight Series is a monthly online talk featuring an SFAI alumni. The word community is woven kind of as a looser theme between the artists. I would like to extend a thank you to the SFAA board that includes Maria, Annie, Brianna, Christina, Linda, Marian, Tobin, and my fellow advisors. Also a special thank you to all the alumni donations that fund this ongoing program. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that San Francisco is the ancestral land of the Ohlone, Ramaytush, and the Muwekma peoples. Just kind of throwing that out there because Native American Heritage Month just wrapped up, but we can kind of celebrate and uplift Native American heritage every day. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker here today. Mercedes Dorame is a Gabrielino Tongva born and raised in Los Angeles, California. Mercedes received a bachelor's from University of California, Los Angeles in 2003, and an MFA from San Francisco Art Institute in 2010. Mercedes currently teaches at the School of Arts and Cal Arts. Dorame's artwork includes photography and installation and has been featured in exhibitions at the Artist Museum, the Smithsonian Institution, LACMA, to name a few. Her work is part of the permanent collections of the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles and the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. Recent awards for her artwork include the 2020 Creative Capital Award, the 2018 Foundation for Contemporary Arts Grant, and the 2018 Artist Commission Program for the Montblanc Art Collection. Her work will be in an upcoming exhibition about kinship at SF MoMA opening May 20th, and in a commission with Getty Center opening summer 2023. Mercedes' work can be seen currently at the Huntington Library, part of a long-term Borderlands exhibition, and at the Catalina Museum for Art and History, the Crossing Waters exhibition. So with that, please join me in welcoming Mercedes Dorame to the San Francisco Art Institute Alumni Association Spotlight Series.
Hey, thank you all. It's been it's nice to do these. Well, I've gotten used to doing these on Zoom a little bit more, but it's nice to do it in like a small, intimate group and support the SFAI alumni efforts. So I'm going to jump in. I have a lot of images. I realized when I do talks, I kind of start at the beginning, which is SFAI for me. And so I'm going to go beginning and I'll move through. So at the end, please pull me back to places or ask questions, just kind of as a caveat. So I'm going to share screen, get this going. As Rai mentioned, I did an undergraduate at UCLA, but in literature. And I didn't know how involved and how deeply involved I would be in the arts at that point in my life. And when I applied to SFAI, I actually got into the postbac program, which, maybe all of us were like trying to get into the MFA, and then you get into the postbac and you're like, oh, I don't know, maybe this feels funny. But the 3 years actually really helped me. I needed the 3 years. And so I'm really grateful for that. And one of the first projects I did was around my Tongva ancestors. This was when I was working with Linda. And I think I was showing some really I think she called them melancholy photographs in black and white. And one day in Crit, she was like, what's the source of this? Like, where's all this melancholy coming from? And I was like, oh, well, that's a really good question. And I realized it was kind of these my ancestors and the story I and my experiences in connection with that. So I'll get a little bit more into that in the next body of work. But where I started was this this work with my grandparents. They lived in Los Angeles. My dad is the youngest of 9, and this is how I remember my grandparents. They were in West Los Angeles. They tried very hard to fit in, and they didn't always talk so openly about their indigeneity. And so my dad handed me this disc of images. I was looking at them on my computer and I realized I didn't always recognize them. Like, this is also my grandparents, but they were born in the early 1900s. So there was a really big generational gap. And I never saw my grandmother with her hair down like this, you know? So I started to kind of really try to uncover what some of these stories were. So what my memories were with them, how they connected to their culture that had to kind of go, I always say it kind of had to like go covert. And what I started to realize is that wasn't just my family, that was a lot of Native people, well, I would say many, if not most Tongva people, but also other Native people at the time, because um, Native people were not considered citizens of the United States until 1924. So if you claimed that personhood, you weren't even considered, you know, part of citizenship in a city like Los Angeles. And so I came across these pictures. This is my grandmother in the Colorado River. And I love this image, but I don't know the story. And it was really hard not to know the stories and grapple with the kind of gaps in information that I felt on a personal level. And so a lot of this project was about kind of reinfusing these people into my apartment where I was living at the time, and kind of recreating the memories and recreating these imprints into my my experience, because a lot of the stories had been kind of tucked away. I had memories with my grandparents, like, okay, so I'll do this since it's like a small group, but like, that's me, the little girl dancing with my grandfather, you know? And so those are kind of the memories I had. But when I really started to think about what they went through living in a place, Los Angeles, during a time when it wasn't really, I mean, it wasn't really you couldn't survive if you were like, there was no livelihood that you could, you know, be getting jobs unless you kind of hid that part. And so, you know, as a younger person, it was hard to kind of grapple with. I wish I knew more. I wish I had the stories. I wish they had been more open. But I started to understand, like, societally, why some of that was hidden. This picture on the left is my grandparents' house where I grew up playing. It was really the center focus. And when I was making some of these images, my aunt told me the story that the neighbors in that neighborhood had sent around a petition trying to stop my grandparents from moving in there because of the color of their skin. And so something like that really hit me very hard, because you think of home having, you know, I talk about home a lot. I talk about land. I talk about belonging. And having that be the narrative around your kind of safe space would be really hard. It also made me think about how this place was a gathering place, how it was so important for community. And it made me also think about these other experiences I had. And so when Linda asked that question, what I really was thinking about is the work I'd been doing since I was 18 as a cultural consultant on development sites where Native people, my ancestors, I mean, I only work in Tongva territory, but ancestors or their belongings are being dug out of the ground to make way for usually like housing developments, like tract housing or like strip malls. So I participate in this because, one, it's necessary work. My father does it almost exclusively, and he needed my help. But as part of the process, you're giving recommendations. It's not, you have no power really. And it was really hard. This is my father, not in the hat. And it was really hard. And he said, you know, your job is always just to remind people of the personhood, these people who are getting unearthed or taken out of the ground. It's somebody's mother or father or child, or all, you know, all of the above, you know, and to remind people in this environment that can be really clinical or inhumane, honestly, to remember the personhood. And so where this took me was the site where we were doing a reburial. So this site particularly where I took these photographs, which is, I don't show these on my website. Like, I like having these in context of my voice, because it's the only work I've done where I'm talking about actual the surroundings of this process. And what really became interesting are the objects, the materials, the ceremony that is part of this, that was part of that. And we have records of some of our ceremony. Some things have been passed down, but some is constructed. And when I think about that, I had to I feel like Linda also pulled that out of me, because I didn't want it to be constructed. I wanted it to, you get kind of caught up in like, oh no, it has to be completely authentic. But actually, for me, ceremony has to kind of move and breathe and live to continue on. And I don't think we were ever meant to have reburial ceremony. Burial, yes, but to have people dug out of the ground and have to go through this, it's not something that would have something in the past. It wasn't something that was done. So I, really got interested in the residue, like the residual materials, all this yarn that had been wrapping the sage, the space, and what it was like. This paper, and I'll speed up. I feel like I'm going really slow, and I apologize, but this paper was really important. The space we were in, my father put up this prayer in Tongva. It has English translation, and then it has his notes about how to pronounce the word. Tongva has very interesting pronunciation and a lot of kind of interesting sounds. And it wasn't like intuitive to him, this one word. And I was writing a paper while I was at SFAA about this, and now I teach, and I always tell my students, if you're given the opportunity, write about your own work, because it can be really helpful. And I looked at this and I thought, oh, I'm doing the Curtis thing. I'm like, it's a vanishing race. The words are disappearing. The water is erasing it. And I, I was nervous, because I don't want to do that. I don't want to portray this story of Native people vanishing. But what I realized is actually, because of this process, because of the amount of times we sang the song and learned the words, the ceremony or the song or the prayer becomes internalized, and it's almost an empowering moment where the paper becomes not necessary. So it's not a vanishing, it's an empowerment. And that was really important for me. And it really got me thinking about my identity at large, in a larger sense. And these are my other grandparents. So these are my mom's grandparents, who lived in Malibu, in our tribal territory, the southern part of Malibu, which borders with the Chumash. And they lived in this piece of land in this area, because it wasn't really a desirable place to live when they moved out there in the 50s. He was a school teacher, she was a stay-at-home mom. It wasn't that they were particularly wealthy, but they also moved into a housing development that had a race clause in it. So they had access, to this land. But, there was a midden on this hill, which is like means that people were living there. This mesa has, I was just at the Autry in their collections doing some work there, and I saw the Las Flores Mesa on the list of, places where they had objects from. And so, it's clearly a place where Native people lived. And I started thinking about this land and what my interactions were and what I grew up with. It was like a place of refuge, this kind of gatherings place of my mom's side of the family. But it was also a refuge. Like the kids would just go outside, like the parents did all their whatever was happening inside, and we just played in the hillsides. And so I kind of started this series that I say they're ceremonial interventions in the landscape. And this is, in the beginning was Fox and Cinnamon. I just think that's a good title, because I was really looking at this place and trying to kind of reconcile again my experience with the land, what the imprint of the Native people who lived there before, all of the politics around why I had access to it. It's not because it's tribal territory, but it's because it's privately owned by my my grandparents and why that I think has been such an important through line in all of my work is because the Tongva people are not federally recognized, which means we aren't allocated any land by the federal government. And that, for me, was the symptom of the dissension and difficulty that our tribe has experienced at times, is a symptom of that, not having gathering space. I mean, I talk to people all the time when they talk about, oh, then my grandparents passed away and the family dispersed. And I think about that kind of experience or family, somebody holding that kind of space together and what that does to people. And I think that, losing your own land has that same effect on a broader community of people. So I started looking at other places in Los Angeles, watering springs. I kind of come back to this again, throughout the city that have these imprints of native Tongva people. Because often when you think about Los Angeles or the kind of visual around Los Angeles, it's, freeways and, the Hollywood sign and downtown skyscrapers, and people don't think about it as being culturally rich or having these outdoor spaces that are rejuvenating. And this is a grinding bowl in a boulder at a spring that my ancestors made, / maybe Chumash, like the Chumash came down, we went up, we intermarried. So, but definitely native people made this grinding bowl. And so also near a freshwater spring, which I think is a way for people to understand that native people have always been in Los Angeles, will always be. But sometimes I work on these sites and people were kind of surprised, like, oh, there were people buried there, or there are things there. And I kind of go, well, do you think you're the first person who wants to live in Southern California on a bluff overlooking the ocean? Probably not. Like, it's a beautiful place. It's a rich, and I don't mean that money. I mean, like, it's beautifully abundant. And so trying to get people to contextualize their own concepts of a place through looking at these places, these kind of sites throughout Los Angeles. The other, part of this is that it's always in land that has a temporary access point. Even this property, this kind of land that my grandparents held, when they passed away, my mother, aunts, uncles sold it. And so I don't have access to this space anymore. And I kind of knew that when I was making these images, it was like about to be sold. And so I kind of see these as like a goodbye moment to this space. But at the same time, I've been learning the Tongva language. There's a language group. The beautiful way that I've heard people talk about it is that the language has been sleeping and we're trying to wake it up. But this image, I like to say the title of also because it speaks to how understanding language, which goes back to my UCLA, I like words. I kind of get caught up in word usage, but how it can change the way you think. So the title of this image is Hikaye, which in Tongva means breath, spirit, and wind. And I just thought it was so beautiful to think of breath, spirit, and wind to be the same thing. And so I try to I now translate my titles in Tongva, which is not always easy. I sometimes play little games in the translation that probably only I will ever get. But really trying to work through them in ways. This one is titled Shishanga, which is the land of the dead. And when I took to the land of the dead, which is when I first took this photograph, I was just totally captivated by that space of the interior. And I always, the way I've started describing this is the first portal that I made in collaboration with a spider. Because I kind of talk about portals later. Actually, when I start working in these kind of other spaces, it was in 2018 when I did the hammer. Oh wait, I'm not going to get there yet. I'm going to talk about these stones and then I'll get there. I started working in these sculptural objects, also in reference to my work as a cultural consultant on sites. So these star stones, what I call them, are very closely replicas of what would be archaeologically termed cogged stones or cogged stones. And I worked on a site where we found these and I held them in my hands, and they're this intricate, the star shapes, the patterning. This is actually from that site I worked on. They're incredibly beautiful, but we don't know their story. And I think about, to lose the story of an object this intentional, this clearly purposefully made thing. And to me, that is another way to express to people even the federal government, like they want this continuous legacy or this line, this narrative that's like point A to point B and very neatly checked off. And to think about a story like this getting lost speaks to the depth and the excruciating like damage that happened in Southern California to Indigenous people. And so that's part of the story for them, but I didn't want to leave them in that story. I wanted to make them myself and to imagine what they might be. So like I had a lot of, well, it wasn't fun in the beginning. I made these for the Hammer Show. I had 3 weeks start to finish to learn how to cast concrete, which was not by myself. I was doing a residency at the other SFAI in Santa Fe. And I wanted to make them myself because I wanted to, one, take a step away from the actual object because we don't know what they were for. And so I wanted to kind of create my own artistic interpretation and not say I'm replicating a Tongva ceremony. Like I actually need to caveat that like I'm never replicating Tongva ceremony. It's the expression within me from my experience with the community. But what's beautiful about these is everyone I like talk to about them can have an imagination of what they're for. For me, I use them as star maps. This was the piece at the Hammer, and I did Pahe Shishiyot, which is 3 big stars, which is our word for Orion's belt. And I was thinking about being in Los Angeles and what constellation you can see, not many, and usually it's Orion. Like I remember as a kid, that was the one I could pick out of the sky. But it also marks east to west. So like it's an orienting constellation as well. I mean, everything moves east to west, but it has like a point of rising and setting. And so this was kind of, titled A Map for Moving Between Worlds. And I was thinking about these stones becoming anchor points to like, when you move into other worlds, they kind of create the map of how to get back to here. And these were shown in collaboration with the photographs, some from the sites that I worked on and some of the ceremonial interventions. And it was the first time I really worked in this kind of an installation space. There was a time when I stopped making a lot of images because I felt like it wasn't, it's hard. It was in grad school. I'm sure Linda maybe remembers this, because I wasn't getting a response that maybe I felt like I would get up and try to talk about my work and I would be like trying not to cry and the people in the room would be like, I don't know, like it wasn't like something wasn't hitting. And part of that I've come to understand is just like the context and the way the showing and how we kind of, get wrapped up in our own experience sometimes. But at that point, I was thinking about objects in relationship to my work. I think there's always been a really heavy connection between objects and my photography because so much of my context with my native ancestry is through these sites where it's, these cultural belongings coming from the earth. So I kind of continue that connection by making these installations. A lot of them have imprints this is cinnamon that references the ochre, which was the material in that bowl, which we use in ceremony, but I switched it to cinnamon to kind of play or like question or press into like, what does it mean that we can't get ochre very much anymore? And it's hard to find and we don't have the land access to be able to gather it, but I have cinnamon and it looks the same in a photograph. What is it? So I'm playing a little bit with that. But I think that these function differently than the photographs. I still feel like my photographs create a framing for the viewer. I get to do the scale. I get to kind of give access and also create a permanent record of indigeneity in Los Angeles, which is necessary. And I came to, by like taking a little break, I realized why I was using the camera. Instead of it being the default tool, I started to understand that I needed to use this tool. It was important to use this tool because of those reasons. And then also kind of work in conjunction. I started making work that was referential. It's often referential to like this was the spring equinox. I made some on this, the other one was near an eclipse. And so I was thinking about eclipses. And I think about these phenomena in like an eclipse or the equinox or the super bloom that was happening in Southern California where hundreds of thousands of people went to see, hillsides filled with poppies. And I think about our desire to still gather and have these kind of experiences, and that's important, and it always has been. Um, this is a small piece I, did with the Autry. I don't like that picture. I'll skip to this one. Because I was thinking about home and land and what does it mean? And the same, like, how do we gather? How do we create space for that? And so this was kind of a fun piece where I took images of people on an instant camera and had them like pose. And then I asked them to write what home meant to them just on the bottom. And then I hung them in the space. And it created this really beautiful conceptual map of what people considered home. And it, some was kind of overlapping, but some was just really beautiful to kind of question that. How tied is that to place? How tied is that to people? I think about these things all the time. I've also moved around the world a lot and I think I moved every 2 years. I don't know, and it's, yeah, for a very long time. And so I was constantly uprooting myself in a way. And so I really wanted to I question that a lot. And this has the Tongva words for the directions on the plinth. I'm gonna go that my work it took a lot of like flip-flops in certain senses. I've moved around a lot lately. But this was a show at Frankel Gallery that Richard Mizrak curated, and he called me up, which was like kind of like a shock to get a call from Richard Mizrak, I'm not gonna lie. And he's like, I want you to do a wall installation. And I was like, a what now? What am I doing? I'm like, but this is Frankel. Like, I make photographs. Couldn't I just hang some photographs? He was like, no, I want a wall installation. I was like, okay. So I was a little nervous because I had gone to this gallery for gallery nights when I was in, going to SFAI, and it was like a big compliment to like put something on the walls there. And it was this beautiful experience. The people there were so lovely to work with. I was nervous because I thought, oh, this is not what they usually show. But they were actually really excited. And so I did all these photograms with objects like, the cinnamon or the kind of fabrics. And I was making these kind of imagined landscapes because the whole show it was called Another West, and it was in reference to Carlton Watkins. I was like, okay, so what's the legacy of Carlton Watkins, these expansive spaces? And for me, what I think my response was to kind of reintroduce the native body into those spaces because they weren't empty and they weren't untended spaces. So for me, it was kind of this imagination, like, how do we imagine the West? How do we imagine, what is the concept around American landscape? This is kind of, okay, so as close as I got to, I don't usually do self-portraits, but like these are Polaroid negative backs. That's like as close as I got to putting myself in there. But that I felt like I needed to have that presence. This is, things that I put on the wall. I think my daughter brought these home from preschool and said, here, Mom, this is for your art. And why that's important to me is because I love that she thinks about the natural world and these flowers as being part of an artistic practice. Maybe how I grew up was like going and looking at impressionist paintings, which I love doing still, and they're absolutely art, but I didn't necessarily, I had to push through some of like, what is art and how do we, what happens if you put this like found rock mounted on a wall? Like, it becomes art. Like, how much can I get people to engage with that? And I also at the same time, so this is a little bit more me. You can see me a little better. I was going through my postcard collection because I love old paper postcards and stuff. And I found, some photographs of Yosemite, which there was one of a waterfall that was all like the fixture hadn't been done right. And so it was fading out. And that same waterfall was in a Watkins print in the other room, like pristine, beautiful. But I just loved that echo existed because it is this like imagination, like there's a beauty to like California and the landscape here and a draw. And I sometimes go other places. I'm like, oh, I could live here. I think about it. And then I fly home and I see the hillsides and I'm like, oh no, but I just love it. So, this was the whole piece. It did come together. I think it was a really fun experience, but I do think a lot about what those concepts are. I'll get into that at the end. I'm going to go through some of this kind of fast because I've done some work outdoors in public spaces recently. And this was during COVID. I mean, I wasn't, I had one piece in a gallery during COVID, but everything else was canceled. And I was working outdoors. And the reason why I think this one was important for me, it didn't function exactly how I wanted, but it was a learning process. And I was using this really beautiful story of our origin story for the Pleiades and Taurus. And it's kind of this tumultuous story that has elements of love and connection. And so this was the Pleiades down below, Taurus was up above, and the sun would go through the constellation in that and hit down on the tarp. And so it was kind of, the sun was, I was trying to use the sun as the connecting element, thinking about things like alignment, how we understand the sky, how we actually understand those subtle shifts, but sometimes you have to tune your body into knowing what the seasons are, or what those moments are. And I would maybe say that it's, my ancestors had a better understanding of that even than I do, where you can track, where the solstice and, alignments happen, and being able to map that and feel that. I try really hard. And it's kind of like living in Los Angeles, where people say, oh, stay for a second, it doesn't have seasons, or California maybe doesn't have seasons. It's like, no, it absolutely has seasons if you pay attention to like the plants and the sky and the light. You can feel it if you pay attention. And so this is the one thing I did maybe during COVID, and I started working on these canvases because those installations, I didn't want to spend like a week in a gallery putting them together. And so I started making these canvases as a backdrop. And this one I made on the winter solstice. And then I kind of arranged on top of them. And then this is another experience I had with the Fowler Museum, where they asked me to curate out of their archaeological collection. And the beauty of this project for me, here's a better view of it. I asked to work from the objects from the site that I showed in the beginning, where I was working with my father. They have everything that wasn't reburied after that. And so I said, I want to work with those objects and see what was held. Now, I also included some of my star stones. So those are the only thing that I kind of included. But, these beautiful bowls and the beads and these things that sit in boxes. And they know that. And it was a really kind of lovely experience, because they said, okay, here are the rows and rows of boxes. Take out what you want. They're your things. And I think to have that relationship with an institution is incredible, because to have that kind of level of trust is important. And, because we're not fairly recognized, we don't have the resources at this time, not saying not ever, but to like have a cultural center, or like, we're working towards these things, but you kind of have to rely on institutions to hold them. And, we have a very good relationship with the Autry and the Fowler, which hasn't always been the case. It really is important, the relationships. And I think that my interest in this site was also, sometimes these sites are disturbed because they're like, oh, but it's so important, these things. And I found bags in boxes with barcodes, which means a lot of work went into collecting and gathering and itemizing and cataloging. And the bag would say unworked lithic. Now, if you have any like reference in the archaeology world, that's very funny, because a lithic is a rock and unworked means nobody did anything to it. So it's a rock, like it's a rock in a box in a bag with a barcode. And I think about that sometimes, because I'm like, so you had to dig things up to put a box, like it just seems absurd. But then there's also the part of me that pulls out these like abalone fragments, and they are important. So I do care about them. So it's like a very complicated relationship. Again, my work has really been tied into objects a lot. So I'm going to show this one last project, and then I'm going to go back into a little bit of photography that's very new. And then I will wrap up. I have no idea where we are in time. I'm okay, right? We're good? Yeah. Okay. So this is another project I did out in public space. I was thinking about like, what are the elements of Tongva community? And for us, there's like the home space, like back to this home, which like everybody needs. And there's medicinal space. And then there's ceremonial space. And I kind of liked one that there was a differentiation. Sometimes like medicine and ceremony kind of overlap. But for me, there's like different levels of threshold of entering a space. And so I wanted to create this space that had those same sort of thresholds of like, exterior, one level in, and then, sorry, I'm trying to show this, the like interior kind of altar space. And also all of our structures have this center opening in the sky, but they function differently. But structurally they are there. And so the kind of this kind of circular structure in the center. And talking about alignments, it was centered over this plinth. Now, did the sun ever perfectly line up with that? No. Like I feel like there's something in the attempt for me, this kind of repeated attempt that is important, and it's probably never going to be perfect, but keeping trying to like understand these alignments. But it was partly about that and the shadows moving. There was a certain point that people started leaving little things on this. I would come, every time I would come, it was different. But at a certain point, people started leaving little notes. And I didn't ask for that. I love that happened. I might have wanted to ask for that, but like people saw it as this kind of special kind of altar space to kind of participate in. It was right by the Los Angeles River, right in downtown LA, which is one of our village sites, Yangna. And I had a really beautiful experience there. I was working on the canvases because I needed more than I realized. So I was out there painting on the tarp in the park. And I looked up and all of a sudden there were like 15 kids and like what looked like a camp counselor standing over me. And I was like, oh no, I'm like so pressed for time right now. And I was like, no, I got to stop. And I was like, so I'm like, hi, I'm like showing them because I use paint to like, I tape down and paint on top. So I showed them kind of like that relief process, what it looked like to like pull the paint back and they could see the yellow come out. And I was telling them a little bit about, the Tongva people, just briefly. And the guy who turns out he's like a teacher, they have this like outdoor school scenario, because I've come to know him now, was like, does anyone remember what the village site here is? And now I've lived in Los Angeles on and off most of my life. And sometimes I'll say Tongva and people are like, what now? Less so. And then I'll say, oh, Gabrielino, because like that's in the 4th grade history book. And they're like, huh? So like there's not always a entire visibility even around our presence. But to know a village site name is like really specific. And a little boy goes, oh, it's Yanga. And I was like, wow, like it was so beautiful that these kids learn this. And it kind of is like that hope where you're like, okay, all the work you do, all the like, like all the work that people before me did and the people before them, it's doing something, it's getting somewhere. And it was really encouraging to hear like those little 8-year-olds being like, oh yeah, I got this village site name. So that was really beautiful. It was really like, the sun, the sky, it was important. So like the last little bits of work, it's kind of new, but I've been working out on the Channel Islands. And these are also Tongva, Chumash land bases. There was people, we went from the mainland to the islands. We call our watercrafts tiats. Chumash called them theirs tamols, but they were plank boats that would cross this water, which is part of the Crossing Waters show at the Catalina Museum, with a lot of thought around this. Because now we go out on a ferry and it takes about an hour. I've sailed out there, it takes 6 hours, but to go over in like a human powered, like with paddle watercraft on a consistent basis is very impressive to me. Speaks to like the sophistication of building the watercrafts, the navigational abilities, the like knowing the water and the seasons and the moments when it's possible. That same sort of attunement. It's been very disorienting to go out there. Well, I'm going to talk a little about this and I'll get back into that. These are abalone alive, which I have never seen out in the world like this in a tidal pool. And so when I was first thinking, maybe I'll just stick here for a second. when I first went out, it was like I was pretty sad, because I was like, wow, this is what it was familiar, because the plants are familiar, the smells are familiar, the light's familiar, but it's kind of that feeling of like, oh, this is what all of Southern California looked like at one point. And it's so beautiful. I think I must have said, oh my God, it's so beautiful. Like, I'm not exaggerating, like 200 times the first trip out there. I just couldn't help myself. It was just so impressed, like such an impression. I've been doing work mostly on the Santa Cruz Island, UC Reserve. And so you feel a little sad, like, oh, it's lost. But then I see these abalones and I'm like, wait, no, they're not lost. They're still there. They're still living. And so maybe these little beings have a ability to tell us how to like remap this in a broader sense somewhere else. So they're like, not just like, oh, this is the past. It's like, oh no, maybe it's also the future. Like, how do we understand this kind of space to kind of reapply the vibrancy of it to a broader space of Los Angeles? I know that's a little like, wide-eyed and optimistic, but for me, it's like I kind of have to be wide-eyed and optimistic in order to kind of keep working. It's always been kind of part of it. I think why I started talking about being Tongva and the experiences on those sites is because I knew if I didn't talk about it, process it, turn it into something that is positive for me, of potential, of possibility, it would be crippling. It could like completely crippling, and so I've been going out there. I've been really interested in these, like, again, all the water, the tidal, the fresh pools, these kind of reversals where you see the sky below and these kind of transparency and the levels, the kind of moments where you kind of come up into a wall in a beach cove and there's just a wall of fossils, that just sits there, and then a golden, bald eagle's flying around you. I mean, it's just these kind of just unreal experiences being out there. And so I'm working. Some of this is going to probably be in the SF MoMA show. I'm working through it. I just got 23 rolls of film back like a couple weeks, so maybe some of that'll go in there too. But it's been really beautiful to get back into working with the camera. I think this is the most direct photography I've made, where I'm not intervening in ways in that like I did in the past, but I think that there's still a certain subjectivity and experience in the way of looking and the way of feeling through the spaces, and what it means to be out there. I don't feel like it's my I don't feel like it's my place to intervene necessarily at these spots. I've also been interested in materials. This is actually asphaltum, so tar, which, yes, sometimes comes up on the beaches because of oil spills, but they're actually natural tar seeps. And that's what coats our yachts with. So that's the a sealant for a water sealant for the watercrafts that was mixed with resin. There's also the abalone, which is a really important material culturally for us, whether it's food source, regalia, ceremonial. And so really looking at the materials of the place. And then this is the other one. This is a steatite, which is a soapstone, which if you've seen a really beautifully carved bowl that's intricate from Southern California, it's probably made from this. And it's probably brought from Catalina Island or Pimugna, which means they carried these huge pieces of stone in a watercraft across that 24-mile channel to be traded and used. And so this is a steatite quarry. So they would kind of carve into the hills and then pop them off and then refine it down into a bowl. So, or other objects. And so I've really been thinking about how impactful these small islands and their materials were on broader communities in the mainland. So I think that's my last image. I will go back to things if people have questions or answer questions, but that's my thing right now. I have new images, which are not in there. I need to add some more in there now that I have more edits done. But yeah, it's a little peek at the new stuff. So
thank you, Mercedes. If everybody can join me in a virtual applause real quick. We do have about 12 minutes for Q&A. and we're a nice kind of intimate group too, so that's nice. But I know I have a few questions, but I'm just throwing it out there. If anybody, I think folks can unmute themselves, or also type into the chat if you have a question. We'll open up for that.
I have a question.
Yes, sorry. I got a question in the chat, but yes, go ahead.
Oh, I can wait.
No, go for it. Go for it.
Oh, okay. Hi, Mercedes. Your work is just, it's beautiful and thought-provoking. And I'm wondering about, in your process, do you do scientific research or interviews, or are you more personal intuition? Can you talk about that?
I would say both. I always laughed. I remember, this was not in Linda's class, but I remember one of my first critiques, someone told me intuition didn't exist. And I was like, oh my God, what now? I was like, what is happening? I think, and I think it's taken me a long time to kind of push into the fact that, yes, I work very intuitively. I think that's heavily part of my process when I'm like in the moment making. However, I do extensive research. Like I have, usually I'm like, hey dad, I'm working on the Channel Islands. And he's like, starts sending me like screenshots of all of his book library, be like, buy all of these. So I do a lot of reading, a lot of research. There's one book on the Gabrielino Tongva people by Macaulay. I think it's called The First Angelinos. It's a really good source. It's like an anthropological source, but there's a lot of firsthand accounts depicted in there. So I do both. I would say that I research, I read, I talk to people. I talk to my father. I talk to other community members. I talk to people at institutions that I know. But when I'm in the moment making, I really try to respond to where I am. I'm sorry, Linda, I'm like calling you out so much here, but I feel like another thing she said to me during class was, it's like, you know, vitamins or nutrients, like you take in all the stuff, the research, but it kind of has to like move through you and your body. It's not like, and then like from your hand shoots out like whatever nutrient. It's like, no, it enables your body to move. And so you kind of need all that research and understanding and input, but the outcome is not a one-to-one, if that makes sense. So yeah.
Thank you.
I had a question. First of all, thanks a lot. It was wonderful to see it all. I really responded to the superimpositions at first when you started your talk. And I also really responded to the two self-portraits that you did have of you.
Yeah.
And having left the place where I'm from too, I'm really dealing with flight instinct and how flight instinct can render you somewhat invisible. And this is something that you had part of your theme, at least in my opinion. And I just felt like I'm missing seeing you in your work. I felt that maybe you're taking over this somewhat almost invisible of your ancestry. And I think it is important to show up.
Yeah.
No, especially if you come from a place of where the origin was denied. I think it is important to show up, to become visible again. Otherwise, it's just like a ghost of ancestry. And I also really related to what you said about having these old photographs and wondering what the story is and being sorry that you don't know more about what is really attached to them. I'm originally from Germany, so there were hardly any photographs, and there's a history that nobody really wants to talk about. So I know this denial and this shame of having left, for instance, or having had to leave. And again, just this stepping out of the ghost reality and becoming real. And at the same time, still let the environment that you're in shine come through. I find that very fascinating. So I really responded to your self-portraits.
Yeah, it's nice to
Thanks.
hear. I mean, I feel like when I started using the camera myself, I got very uncomfortable in front of it. I've gotten much more used to it now. I worked with Cara Romero on she did a series called Tongva Land that I'm photographed in. So I've gotten more used to it. I do a lot more interviews, a lot more kind of on camera stuff. Yeah, it's interesting. I like to kind of always show that there's some sort of a presence in the space and that my hand is there. Um, I think I also think about sometimes I've worked in spaces and I like I'm not saying it's out of the realm of possibility. At one point, okay, so I'll tell a story. The first time I went to the Channel Island, Santa Cruz, I go into the gift shop. You have to go like real early to get on the boat. And I walk into the store, because they have like beanies and stuff and like water. And there's a bookshelf on the wall. And there's a book that I was photographed for and drawn into about the Rainbow Bridge, which is the story of the Chumash origin story of how people got from the island to the mainland. And it looks like me at a younger age. And I kind of freaked out. Like I was laughing. I like went up to the woman and I'm like, hey, look, you want to see something funny? And she was just like, what are you? She was like kind of like taken aback. I was like, that's me. And she was like, and then I showed my friend. So this is part of the Unseen California project, which is Carolina Karlik and Aspen Mays and Tara Krajnik and Dion Lee. So Aspen and Carolina were coming on this first trip, and I showed them, and we were just like kind of freaked out. They're like, "Who are you?" And so Carolina keeps trying to get me to. She's like, "I want to make portraits. Like that has to come in somehow. We need to take photos of you." So I'm not saying it's off the table. It just, I feel like, yeah, it just hasn't really been a lot of part of my process. But I never say never, and I've learned not to ever say like, oh, that's just not something I do, because I've changed around and tried new things. And I feel like that's what keeps me excited about making artwork, being able to kind of try things sometimes. Like I did an AR monument with LACMA, which I am not an AR artist. It's not my thing. It was an interesting experience and I got some really interesting things out of it. But yeah, I feel like being open is really important. So yeah.
I know that Linda, you have your mic unmuted if you want to.
No,
Well,
it's okay. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think I have very few students who paid such good attention. I remember what I said, but Mercedes was a thrill to work with. Her work always came from her curiosity and from her heart. And when she started doing the cinnamon stuff, I was a little curious at first, but she, if I remember correctly, she said that it was something she associated with her grandmother.
Yeah.
That the smell of the kitchen and particularly the cinnamon. So I hadn't realized it was so connected to the ochre.
Well,
wonderful.
it started with I used to make that tea with my grandmother in the kitchen. And so, with scent and smell, like it took me back to that place and being, with her. And it was like one of the only things I could remember having the autonomy to make as a kid, like maybe like I don't know, bologna sandwich and like, this tea. And so that's really where it started from. And then also this kind of, it does visually look so much like ochre, and what does it mean to kind of replace that or not replace that, or how does the camera kind of meld those together visually? So yeah, and I also love when I work with it in spaces, because people come up to me like with the cogstones are like, oh, this reminds me of this thing, and it's like it also like it like sparks memories in the people around, which is really nice too, to kind of get into that space. I think that it's hard to get people open and thinking and kind of it's why I make installations that go up. It's like, yeah, if you move your body position to actually be physically more open, it helps. You can breathe better. You're like, it changes. Like, you know, it changes. Like, what does it do to like look up? Like, it changes you physically, which I think changes you emotionally too. And I think that's always those kind of alignments and connections. But Linda, I'm so grateful to you. It's funny when I do things like this, I'm like, oh, right, all those things. I did pay attention.
You really did. Bravo.
I think that pretty much kind of actually wraps us up. I want to say a thank you to Nicholas, Eve, and Linda for your words. And also, I think I could speak for everybody here when talking about SFAA alumni and faculty that we're so excited to see where you go, Mercedes, and that we're going to be keeping tabs along the way. And especially when it comes to the Getty Center and the SF MoMA, we'll be there cheering from the sideline. So you have the support of the alumni. And this will be on YouTube. So
there was one question in the chat asking about
yeah,
why
go for
it so much. That's okay. I'll take really quickly. I was for a little, for my previous life, I like to say I've had lots of lives. I was connected to the diplomatic community. And so in the diplomatic corps, you move every couple of years. My former partner is a diplomat. So that's why I was moving around the world. But my work has always been very connected to Los Angeles. So it wasn't really my path in the end, but it was important. Yes.
I just want to put in a plug for Mercedes will be speaking for Photo Alliance during the time that her show is up at the SF MoMA. So that'll be in May. So you'll have a chance to see her in person if you're in the Bay Area.
Yeah.
Can SFAA give us the dates for the show so that we can listen to the talk and attend?
Very happy to, Eve. Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
good idea. Very happy.
Yeah, I would love to see
Yeah.
that.
Thank you all for your questions and spending some time Monday morning.
all right, thank you, Mercedes. One last round of applause, everybody.
Thank you. All right.